I'd love to jump into a little bit more about the history of diplomacy, maybe some of the key figures, some of the key events that happened that shaped diplomacy and the way that we do it today. So if you want to jump into that, and I'm sure I've got heaps more questions. And before you jump into that, I just want to point out that I'm gonna read you something from Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, soon, which has very much to do with diplomacy as well. But I want to jump into some of the key aspects of history about diplomacy.
Well, we try to categorize different kinds of, or what goes into human nature. What do people think they're doing? Is it, when they make a move, is it enlightened self-interest, or is it pure self-interest? Is it defensive, or is it fearful? I've heard people say that almost everything about American foreign policy since 1780s has been fear of other things, as opposed to doing other things. But look, for me, the starting point in my head is that Athenian general who went to the island of Melos and told them to stop aiding Sparta, or terrible things will happen to them. This Melian dialogue, which becomes the basis of realism. I mean, if political scientists knew anything about history, they know exactly what this was all about. And this is not only ancient diplomacy at work, it's the first time we see the militarization of diplomacy. That is, the military is carrying out the diplomacy of this particular Spartan state, the way the Prussians carried out German diplomacy in the 19th and 20th century, the early part of the 20th century. It's this militarization. And he says to these leaders in Melos, he says, you must cease and desist immediately supporting our enemies. And the guy says, we're going to have a conversation about this. And the Athenian admiral makes it very clear that if you don't stop right now, terrible things are going to happen. What's going to happen? The men are going to be killed, and the women and children are going to be sold into slavery, and the lands will be burned and salted, okay? That place isn't going to be going for a long, long time. And so the Melos, the guy from Melos says, look, we still have to confer. Actually, he's trying to buy time. And a lot of diplomacy, a lot of defensive diplomacy over history is about buying time. It's very important. And I'll get into that later on when I get to the 20th century, buying time. So the admiral, the good diplomat that he is, and I like military diplomats, they cut right to the quick. There's no discussion of Voltaire or anything like that. They're not interested in philosophy or literature. And he says,
this sounds exactly like a scene from The Godfather, where he sends somebody over to another one of the heads of the families to send them a message, right?
And the message is crystal. He says to them, the powerful do what they can. The weak do what they must. He makes it very clear that if they don't play by these rules, and keep in mind throughout history, whether it's been, who's ever the hegemon of the day, that people have modified behavior until the next wave or crew comes in, and they say no, and they are destroyed. And so this so-called realistic dialogue becomes the benchmark or the baseline for the realist approach. Now, the opposite of realism is not unrealism; it's idealism. It's imagining that if you pursue a goal, that it has transcendent values, and that the other guy will come around to it. If you just listen to me. Well, listening is not enough. If people do not see it in their interest, and in fact, it might even be there's a phrase that was very popular after World War II that people have forgotten. It's about enlightened self-interest. Sometimes you must do something for your neighbor or your adversary or the person you're talking to, which is in your interest too. And the idea is not to say, like Donald Trump says, after the North Koreans get rid of their nuclear weapons, they can have golf courses. They're not interested. But, Americans are interested in getting North Korea to get rid of the nuclear weapons. And the Athenian admiral was very concerned about getting the people on Melos to support his position. and they wouldn't go along with it. So to me, that's kind of like the extreme realist view. Either you do what I tell you to do, or you don't exist. And you might think that the people from Milos were naive, but they preferred to die on their feet than on their knees, to quote some guy from Belarus lately. They knew what was going to happen, but they felt there was no room to maneuver. Now, one of the great diplomats of all time is Jesus Christ. When someone says, "What if Rome is on your back?" and the New Testament says something about you give the Caesar his due, and you give God his due. You can break it up, but when you got laws that are enforced with an iron fist, we're not talking about the next world. I mean, every ancient civilization that back 3,000 years we can read about has got another world. It's about dealing with reality. And, you just can't keep trying to walk through a wall because it doesn't work. Sooner or later, you're going to knock yourself out, and everyone's going to be terribly disappointed in you. Now, the secret here, every negotiation, whether it was in the 8th century with the kingdom of Euphrates, or 4th century BC with the Egyptians, whatever it is, that every diplomatic negotiator has some kind of leverage, some kind of advantage. And the rule is, and I got this from one of the great negotiators, Polonitsa, who wrote NSC 68 about acquiring nuclear weapons in the early 50s. He had a life of diplomacy. He says that the negotiator, the diplomatic negotiator, or what makes all diplomats, gives them a common theme as their role as negotiators. He calls it diplomats quad negotiators. He says they are required to ask for or obtain a little more than their position allows, but never less than their position requires. So, if you've got leverage, you're supposed to at least get a little bit more than you might be entitled to, but never less than you're required to get entitled to. Now, if you walk into a room and you've got no leverage, like the Czechs who went to see Hitler, had him summoned, the president of Czechoslovakia, and told him to roll over in early 39 when they were coming in for the rest of the Czech Republic. The Czechs, it's too late. The Western allies, or France and Britain, had already abandoned them in 38 in September. No one was going to go to war for the Czechs, so the Czechs, they rolled over. And so whether it's the Red Army in 1945 marching through the ancient lands of Eastern and Central Europe, you got to roll with it. And you wait for another day. I think there was a great expression during the Cold War about adjusting to your circumstances, and it was better read than dead, because we're going to outlive these guys. And I was in Czechoslovakia at a celebration of their return to independence, and it was quite clear they knew how to survive. And one day it's the Germans are marching in, and then after the Second World War is over, then the Russians are marching in. In fact, they had the same headquarters. Nazi headquarters and the Red Army headquarters were the same building, which is where my conference took place. And they learned, let's call it adaptability. You learn how to adapt through study of your nation's own diplomacy. And you learn some very important things. I mean, here in Australia, just to jump ahead for a moment, you can't understand Australian diplomacy without understanding Australian geography. Sometimes geography tells you what your diplomacy is going to be. For example, in this country, you got something like thousands of miles of coastline, and you need a navy if you're going to keep somebody out. And so you need allies to do this kind of thing. So you got 12,500 miles of coastline, which is the distance between Sydney and London via Suez. So early on, Australia had this deal. And the deal was, the imperial deal was, they'll give the British troops to use in the Middle East, whether it's First World War or Second World War, in exchange for protection from whom? Well, the Yellow Peril, whatever it is, to the north of them. So they counted on the British Navy as part of their imperial trade-off. That was the great diplomatic bargain that Australians made. And they became a federation. And that was built into it, sort of baked in. People don't talk about it because it sounds a little cynical. But I'll tell you, after the British Navy was blown out of the water off the coast of Malaya in February 1942, the deal was over. Australians wanted those troops back in the Middle East. They wanted their own damn Air Force and all the rest of it. And so, sometimes you look at the geography, and there's Milos surrounded by water, dealing with an admiral who's got the ships. Well, that one's kind of a foregone conclusion. You can tease it out, or you can delay it a little bit. The Czechs are right in the middle of two warring factions. That is the Imperial Germans and the Nazis, and then the Red Army. And so they're caught, the meat in the sandwich. And so they're going back and forth. I said to the Czechs, I said, have you had reconciliation commissions or adjudication commissions about returning properties to people or war crimes by either side or by collaboration? And he said, no. He said, they decided not to go there because it would be too messy. There were too many collaborators who collaborated with the enemy, etc. But on the diplomatic track, we learn a lot about why these nations made these choices by just looking at a damn map and seeing their geography. Sometimes geography tells you everything. And then you also learn something else. What are they selling these other people? I mean, what are the Greeks, what are the Spartans selling what are the Athenians selling the people of Milos? What are they selling? And what are Western powers trying to sell people after World War II? What were the communists selling in the 1930s? And this is always very interesting because diplomacy carries with it value-laden terms about we're going to offer you this, this, and this, and does this interest you? And I mentioned in the last podcast, I had a chance to study comparative cognitive systems for 18 months in Vienna, and I got to go through the Soviet bloc, and I early learned that they didn't have anything I wanted. In fact, they didn't have anything that many people wanted. And my observation as a young man was they couldn't come up with the price point of anything. Not only did they not have anything that we wanted, but they couldn't tell you what anything cost that they had. Now we're going from values to the physical stuff. So when diplomacy sort of exposes a number of things, that's why geographers, historical geography, used to be the linchpin to understanding diplomacy. Because if you understood people's geography, for example, you're surrounded by, or you have a big coastline, and you're next to Canada, and so most of your diplomacy in that neck of the woods is going to be a maritime dispute, or who gets the fish. Same thing in the South China Sea right now. Who gets the oil, the gas, the fish, that kind of thing. So geography tells you a great deal, but the value systems. Now I said diplomacy is a wonderful way to cut into foreign cultures so we can understand ourselves. I mean, I could come at this, look at the philosophers of each country. We could look at the literature of each country. We can do it a number of ways, but it seems to me that diplomacy, as I understand the term, subsumes everything else. It literally takes into account people's interests, their value systems, how they're thinking, what they're thinking, and when they're thinking. It seems to me that, the way history used to be the queen of the social sciences and history and humanities, that diplomacy was at the top of the game. Now, diplomatic history is hardly studied in universities in those terms anymore. Now they have courses called intercultural history and stuff like that. But diplomatic history is part and parcel of the history curriculum for hundreds of years. And I think it's making a comeback because, who's going to work the foreign service, the consular offices? Who's going to work for the NGOs, the INGOs, I mean, even Doctors Without Frontiers have to know where the hell they're going and what they're going to be dealing with. And I've talked to people who work in countries that are overrun by terrorists. These are highly idealistic young men and women who then have to cut deals with terrorists to deliver emergency goods to people. It's all about cutting and crossing these different boundaries. And without a diplomatic framework, without knowing how to work with these people. Now, this is not about the art of negotiations. I'm not talking about how FBI profilers always get their man, that kind of thing. I'm talking about negotiations between peoples and the navigating of conflicting ideas. We're not talking about getting somebody out of, Cafe Lynch. It was some guy said it was about negotiations. Yeah, well, it wasn't about negotiations. It was about the failure to understand the importance of the impact of terrorism and what it can do to people and what they really want. I mean, terrorists, for example, they don't have diplomacy. They just want to hurt people. So when we treat them like negotiators, we're playing a really dumb game. We don't understand where they're coming from or what they want to do. But look, I think diplomacy cuts through a lot of this kind of stuff, and it gives us a very clear view. Now, then you get a body of knowledge. It's called international law. And international law is not something that comes from Sermon on the Mount. It comes from accumulated customary law and other kinds of things that the great nations of the day, whether it's the 2nd century, 5th century, or 8th century, whatever it is, it's what they agree on. That's what international law is. The international law is what people can agree on. And even if they can't agree on its implementation later, it's still there to remind people. The Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, outlawing war. Well, it didn't outlaw war at all. It ushered in this terrible Second World War. On the other hand, the principles and ideals and ideas laid out in those laws have become kind of our benchmark about how we move forward. I mean, it's there. But the international law is what the great powers say it is. In the 19th century and early 20th century, the British didn't want to know anything about maritime law that wasn't written by them. They had the British Navy made them the authors of the laws. They weren't going to agree to a damn thing unless it's squared with them. So when Woodrow Wilson says he wants freedom of the seas and stuff like this, is one of the main results of the First World War. The British look at him and say, "Nah, we're gonna define this a little differently." So anyway, I think diplomacy allows us to look at these experiences, to draw lessons from these experiences, to learn things that would make us a little smarter, whatever it is next time. And I think it's a brilliant career. Now, a lot of people study diplomatic history without reading it. Sometimes people say, "Look, I don't want to read diplomatic history. It looks boring. It's what one clerk says to another." Well, actually, it isn't. When you go into a movie theater, an art house, and you see a German movie or a Spanish movie or a Russian movie, and you see how these movies probe the souls of these different cultures and nationalities, you're getting the diplomatic view of how things work. They may even have references and words that mean the same thing, or maybe they mean slightly different things. And so you get to see how people deal with reality, how they deal with the material world, and what they think is important. And so, even going to a foreign movie or trying to read literature, or God forbid, learning a foreign language, it just opens all these other doors, which all lead back to the diplomacy of these countries and their external outlook. Because when you get to the diplomacy of a country, it really tells you a lot about who they are, what they think they are, where they're going. I mean, it's, as I say, I always thought diplomacy reveals the soul of a nation. Their laws reveal the heart of the nation, but the soul, where it thinks it's going. And jumping into diplomacy, I think, and sure, how much can you prepare for this? You just jump into the deep end. I've seen all these people who speak perfect Spanish, perfect Portuguese, and so what's their first job? Is working in China. They tend never to send people where they have all this expertise. And On the other hand, you got some people who've done really nothing with their lives except make money, who wind up as secretaries of state, international trade negotiators. You get people, when during this recent impeachment proceedings, when they introduce people at those hearings as the leading expert on the Ukraine or Eastern Europe or Central Europe or Russia, I'm looking at these people and I'm saying, where in God's name did they get these people? What are their great books? What are their great ideas? And it turns out they got a little bit of experience, so they might speak Ukrainian, etc., and they become the experts. And so when they tell the political appointees what they think is going on, like Donald Trump is subverting the Constitution of the United States, other people don't believe a damn word they say because they don't have the credentials. I mean, they just don't have the credentials. So we get a lot of people who understand other nations who never quite get in the position to influence policy. And this is the nature of the beast. This is why I like the age where you had philosopher kings and warrior kings and warrior diplomats. These are people at the top of their societies who knew where they were headed, and they spoke for everyone else. Or at least they thought they spoke for everybody else. And so I think that's very interesting right there. But